Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling.
During the Second World War, those haunting words, Germany calling, opened Nazi propaganda broadcasts to Britain by an individual referred to as Lord Haw Haw. However, the nasally, sinister and at times hypnotic voice speaking from deep in Hitler's Third Reich was actually that of an Irishman, William Joyce. The story of how a boy raised in the west of Ireland ended up as Hitler's most famous English language propagandist is fascinating. From a childhood in Galway, where he acted as a scout for the Notorious Black and Tans, William Joyce would go on to be suspected of involvement in one of the most notorious incidents of the Irish War of Independence while still a teenager. His life, however, is intriguing, and in this podcast we will follow William Joyce into the upheaval that followed the end of the First World War in Ireland, and then to Britain, where he was drawn to extreme fascism, and eventually to Nazi Germany. Hello and welcome to the Irish History Podcast. My name is Finn Dwyer. Now today's episode looks at the life of William Joyce, better known as Lord Haw Haw, a figure who's often lampooned by modern histories of the Second World War. However, as we're going to see in this podcast, this perspective masks the extremely dangerous and violent history of Joyce. Now, it's a great story that I want to get straight into, so I have just one quick announcement. The first 5 episodes of my exclusive series on the outbreak of the Troubles are now available at patreon.com/Irish podcast. The latest episode in the series, that's part 5, was released last week and it looks at the story of Bloody Sunday. You can get that and the other 4 episodes in the series so far. It's over 2 hours of exclusive content based around interviews with Dr. Brian Hanley from the History Department of Trinity College Dublin. You can get these at patreon.com/Irish podcast. That's patreon.com/Irish podcast. Sound on the show is by Kate Dunlea. If a stereotypical Irish childhood at the turn of the 20th century began anywhere, it was in New York. A statistic I've often quoted on the show before is that by 1900, 2 in every 5 Irish people were living overseas. So it was little wonder that when the Mayo native Michael Joyce and his wife Gertrude had their first son William, the family were living in the New York borough of Brooklyn. Michael himself had emigrated to the US in 1888 at the age of 19 and was in many ways what you might describe as the archetypical Irish emigrant of the time. He was a Catholic and had grown up on a small farm in the west of Ireland. In the US, Michael Joyce had gone on to enjoy moderate financial success and had become a US citizen in the 1890s. However, there was one curiosity about Michael Joyce, and that was his politics. Although a Catholic, he was extremely patriotic and proud of the British Empire. Now, among his generation, a growing scepticism and opposition to the Empire was far more common, and his political outlook may well have shaped Michael Joyce's choice of partner in life. While most Irish Catholic emigrants chose to marry a co-religionist, often coming from the same county or even the same parish they did, Michael Joyce, a man who stood against the grain in such matters, chose a very different path. In 1905, he had married Gertrude Brooke, a Protestant who had been born in Lancashire, England. Now, within weeks of their marriage, Gertrude had fallen pregnant, and in April 1906, she gave birth to the couple's first and without question most well-known child, William, who was born in the family home on Herkimer Street in Brooklyn. Whether Michael Joyce had always intended to return to Ireland is unclear, but in 1909, he moved his family back across the Atlantic. While returning home to Ireland was becoming a more feasible option for Irish emigrants due to cheaper and faster travel, it was also indicative of the success Michael Joyce had enjoyed in the USA, which had afforded the family a degree of comfort back in Ireland. The Joyces, including the now 3-year-old William, would first settle in County Mayo, where Michael Joyce bought a pub in Westport. However, after a few years, they would move again, this time to Galway City. Now, if the Joyces had stood out as unusual in their worldview among the Irish emigrant community in New York, this was doubly so back in Ireland. The decades between 1888, when Michael Joyce had first emigrated, and 1909, when he returned to Ireland with his young family, had seen seismic changes in the political landscape at home. The foundations of British rule, which Michael Joyce held in such high esteem, were already crumbling in Ireland. Landlords, once the corner of British rule, were selling up their estates, while nationalists were increasingly coming to dominate political life on the island. However, Michael and his wife Gertrude remained strident supporters of the British Empire and raised their children with a devotion that was fanatical at times. William Joyce, their eldest son, who only turned 10 in 1916 and was far too young to serve in the First World War, would later recall, "I was brought up by my parents in a creed of fanatical patriotism. I was taught to love England and her empire. Patriotism was the highest virtue I knew." William was, however, raised in the Catholic faith of his father and was educated by the Jesuits in Galway. Known for strict discipline and high educational standards, the classroom where William learned may have been austere, but he did receive an excellent education which he would use later in life. However, from an early age, he also developed a keen sense of politics. Indeed, in school, his nose was badly broken when he got into another fight with a boy who called him an orange man. Through his early teens, William Joyce continued on this trajectory and began to gravitate towards radical politics. Now, in the highly politicised world of post-World War I Ireland, this in itself was not that unusual among his contemporaries. Thousands of young teenagers were activists in the Fianna, a Republican youth organisation, but William Joyce, in line with his family values, set out on a very different trajectory. After the Irish War of Independence broke out in 1919, he would begin to associate with the British Crown Forces. While still a young teenager, in 1920, as British power in Ireland seemed to be disintegrating, the British government would recruit two notorious new police forces, the Black and Tans and the Auxiliaries. Raised from former servicemen, the units quickly garnered a notorious reputation for brutality. However, William Joyce, still only 14 years of age, began to associate with the Black and Tans and the Auxiliaries in Galway. Indeed, very serious allegations and rumours began to swirl around the teenager, with people claiming he was acting as a scout for the Crown Forces, something which did eventually come to the attention of the IRA in Galway. Joseph Toker, an IRA intelligence officer, would later say the organisation suspected William Joyce was implicated in one of the most notorious murders of the time, that of Father Michael Griffin. At 11:30 p.m. on November 14, 1920, what was described as a youth had called to the priest's house saying he was urgently needed. The priest left, but was never seen alive again. 6 days later, on November 20th, Griffin's body was found dumped in a bog with a gunshot to the head. Now, Joseph Toker, that IRA intelligence officer operating in Galway, later recalled his belief that it had been the 15-year-old William Joyce who had lured the priest to his murder. While this was never proven, there was no question, though, that William Joyce was acting as an informer for the Crown Forces in Ireland during this period. In the following year of 1921, during a truce between the IRA and the British Army, the Republican movement would discover William Joyce was in possession of a Royal Irish Constabulary cipher used to encode letters. Eventually, his activities would see him in effect exiled from Ireland. Late in 1921, Michael Staines arrived in Galway for negotiations with the British authorities in the city. When he was leaving, the 15-year-old William Joyce, while in the company of members of the Auxiliaries, jeered and spat at Staines. His bodyguard wanted to kill the teenager on the spot, but Staines stopped him, and before he left Galway, Michael Staines informed the British military authorities that he could no longer guarantee William Joyce's safety in the city. Joyce would very quickly afterwards leave Galway and never return, and his family also would leave in the following years as well. Moving to Britain, Joyce had few options open to him, so he would lie about his age and enlist in the British Army in the Royal Worcestershire Regiment. However, he would fall sick in 1923, and during his treatment, his real age, he was still only 17 and too young to serve in the army, was revealed. This would see him drummed out of the army. However, even though he was only 17 years of age, William Joyce was gravitating towards fascism and setting out on a road that would eventually lead him to Nazi Germany. After he was kicked out of the British Army in 1923, William Joyce embarked on an academic career. He would initially enrol in Battersea Polytechnic to study maths and chemistry, in the hope of eventually going on to study medicine. But on discovering he was ill-suited to this, he dropped out and went on to enlist in the University of London, where he studied English and history at Birkbeck College. He was a highly intelligent individual, and Joyce graduated in 1927 with a first-class honours degree. Oddly, he shared a very similar academic trajectory to another even more famous fascist propagandist, Joseph Goebbels, with both men taking an intense interest in philology, the study of languages. But more importantly, Goebbels, Joyce, and a generation of fascists across Europe shared many common traits and life experiences. They both had experience of violent conflict. In Germany, for example, those too young to fight in World War I had participated in extreme violence in suppressing left-wing uprisings in Germany. In those experiences, they had strong echoes of Joyce's own time in Ireland during the Irish Revolution. Indeed, British fascists would find many converts among the defeated Unionist and Loyalist side in that conflict in Ireland. But aside from their experiences of violence, fascists across Europe also shared a hostility towards democracy and a dramatic difference between their romantic visions of the world and the reality of life as it was in the 1920s. In the case of William Joyce, his romantic ideals were based around notions of the British Empire his parents had taught him, while German fascists harked back to an imperial Germany that had existed before the First World War. Now, while these shared experiences were drawing such men towards fascist parties across the continent, William Joyce was drawn to an organisation called the British Fascisti, a group formed in 1923 and inspired by Mussolini's seizure of power in Italy that same year. In this organisation, he was drawn further and further into a world of violent activism, as people like Joyce were increasingly resisted by anti-fascists. In one confrontation in 1924, William Joyce's face was slashed from his ear to his mouth, leaving him with a notable scar for the rest of his life. However, in that encounter he was lucky. Later in life he would recall how another fascist died from an infection he sustained after being stabbed in the testicle with a hat pin. Now, through the late 1920s and early 30s, William Joyce began to emerge as a prominent figure on the British far-right and fascist movements. This took him through several organisations. In the late 1920s, like many fascists, he would gravitate towards the Conservative Party. But Joyce was never going to last in such a broad organisation. He was an extremist even within the far right, and he would join the British Union of Fascists, a group formed by Oswald Mosley in 1932. Now, through the early 1930s, Mosley's outfit enjoyed considerable successes, and Joyce became a major figure, certainly on the right of British politics, as he served as the British Union of Fascists Director of Publicity. In this role, Joyce honed his skills of public speaking and became a highly regarded orator, which would become very important when he would move to Nazi Germany. His speeches at the time were the stock in trade of fascist orators, who played on fears and prejudices in an effort to polarise their audiences. They were also obviously extremely anti-Semitic. Indeed, while anti-Semitism was par for the course in European fascism, William Joyce was considered even on the right to hold extremist views in this regard. This worldview would lead Joyce to argue that Jews were controlling almost every aspect of life. This would range from claims that the person who had slashed his face in 1924 was Jewish, to the notion that every major event in history could be attributed to Jewish influence. His theories on this front would find voice in a rambling history called Twilight over England. In this book, Joyce would add his own Irish angles, claiming, for example, that Jews had been responsible for the British withdrawal from the Irish Free State. This absurd idea was based around a false claim that the last British Chief Secretary for Ireland, Harmer Greenwood, was Jewish. Joyce falsely claimed his real name, in fact, was Harmer Grunwald. Now, as the 1930s wore on, the British Union of Fascists began to encounter major problems. In 1936, they suffered a public and humiliating defeat at the hands of anti-fascists who successfully resisted an attempt to march through the East End of London, which had a large Jewish population. That march had been arranged to celebrate the 4th anniversary of the British Union of Fascists, so when it failed, it was highly embarrassing. They were also facing considerable internal ideological differences as well. Ironically, given what lay ahead for his life, Joyce was increasingly disillusioned with Oswald Mosley's leadership because he considered Mosley to be enthralled to European fascist leaders when Joyce believed they should have been developing a British form of fascism. This would eventually see Joyce leave the Union of Fascists and set up his own organisation, the National Socialist League, but this was an abject failure. Indeed, as the 1930s drew into its final years, the tide was starting to go out on fascism in Britain. Having faced stiff resistance from anti-fascists throughout the decade, its legitimacy among the wealthy and powerful was also starting to decline. Through the early and mid-1930s, fascists like William Joyce had found admirers in the highest offices of British politics, from the royal family to senior Conservative politicians. However, from 1938 onwards, as Hitler's growing territorial ambitions began to threaten British interests, choices had to be made, and British leaders increasingly began to voice opposition to fascism. Indeed, by the summer of 1939, as war with Nazi Germany was now imminent, fears among British fascists like William Joyce began to grow that they would all be rounded up and imprisoned. This would prompt William Joyce to take a drastic step. In late August 1939, he decided to leave Britain and move to Germany. This would be the second time in his life he had effectively been exiled because of his extremist views. In 1921, he had been forced to leave Ireland by the IRA, and in 1939, he left Britain under similar circumstances. A few weeks after he sailed for Germany, the German army would invade Poland, triggering World War II, and within a few days of that declaration of war, Joyce took another decisive step when he not only decided to live in Nazi Germany, but also do what he could to help the Nazi state in the war. Now, before we continue on with his story and how he became Lord Haw Haw, I have a quick, exciting announcement about an upcoming series. Through the month of June, I have a new, really exciting series for you. It's called 3 Days in July, The Forgotten Story of a Victim of the Troubles. This has been in production for over a year, and I think when you listen, you'll realise why it took so long to make, but I'm really excited now to be able to share it with you finally. The series 3 Days in July looks at events in Belfast in 1970 and focuses in on one weekend and the story of a victim of the Troubles who's been largely forgotten and written out of history. Digging into his murder took me into some of the most notorious and pivotal events of the early Troubles, the Falls Curfew, but it also took me into the sinister world of black propaganda and psychological operations run by the British Army in the early 1970s. Now, it's a fascinating series that uses recently declassified documents and some of the latest research into the topic. All you have to do to get the series is to make sure you're subscribed to the show. So if you want to pause now and just make sure you're subscribed to the Irish History Podcast in whatever app you're listening to this. Alternatively, if you don't want to wait until the show drops there, you can become a supporter at patreon.com/Irish Podcast and get exclusive early access. But that series, 3 Days in July, is dropping in June, and I think you're going to absolutely love it. Now, let's get back to the story of William Joyce. Having moved to Berlin, William Joyce was left with a very uncertain future, given he had no career as such that he could put to use to earn money. Germany, in 1939, was not exactly short of fascist organisers. However, on September the 6th, only 3 days after the outbreak of the Second World War, he was asked to broadcast on the Nazi English radio station, Reich. This was one of many stations the Nazis used to broadcast to other countries. I have an interview in the back catalogue about a station called Radio Red Action, the Nazi station that targeted Ireland. I have a link to that episode in the show notes below. But there's no doubt that Reichsrundfunk, the one that broadcast to Britain, was among the most famous. And when Joyce agreed to broadcast on this, This would become a move that made him world famous, or rather infamous as it would be in his case. Initially, Joyce was only one of several broadcasters, and very early on, as early as September the 14th, 1939, they were all dubbed Lord Haw Haw by the English journalist Cyril Dalmain, who wrote under the pseudonym Jonah Barrington. He mocked the style of speech in these broadcasts, deriding the presenters in the following terms, saying they spoke English of the haw haw, damn it, get out of my way variety, and his strong suit is gentlemanly indignation. Now, the name Lord Haw Haw would catch on after Barrington printed those words in an article, and while it initially started out as a collective term for several broadcasters, it would become exclusively associated with William Joyce, because he was unquestionably the most famous and successful of all the pro-Nazi English language broadcasters. Indeed, the audiences that he commanded in Britain at the start of the war were staggering in size. In 1940, the British government were so concerned that they conducted a survey of the wider population, and this estimated that 2/3 of the population of the United Kingdom were tuning in to Joyce at one point or another. Indeed, by late 1939, there's no question that William Joyce was the voice of Nazism in Britain. Now, when we think of Nazis today, I think the image of a gesticulating and screaming Adolf Hitler comes to mind, but very few English people could speak German, so there was little point in broadcasting his speeches. The voice of Nazism in Britain, as I say, was William Joyce because of his broadcasts. When he took to the microphone, Joyce started with a notorious catchphrase that you heard at the start of the show called Germany calling, Germany calling. And then the following broadcast consisted of a blend of news, commentary, and a fair share of blatant lies. Now, his overall intention was to undermine British morale, so he mocked British leaders, he would inflate German successes, and forecast disaster for the Allies. Even 75 years later, there is something haunting about his presentation style. Those words, Germany calling, crackling through the static, have a certain disconcerting edge. And his nasal tone, the effect of that school fight in Galway in the 1910s, also created a unique nature to his broadcasts. Sometimes modern historians present an almost comical view of Joyce in these years and downplay the impact of his broadcasts. However, in 1939 and particularly 1940, his broadcasts must have had a deeply threatening impact on the wider population in Britain. Germany had, after all, in the summer of 1940, scored a string of military victories, particularly its rapid invasion of France, that made it seem likely that they were invincible, and by the late summer of 1940, an invasion of Britain seemed imminent. In one broadcast, Joyce told his British listeners, "Not only invasion, but starvation stares England in the face." This must have been deeply alarming to hear. Now, the impact of these broadcasts at the time was probably multifold. It's generally believed that they probably didn't sap British morale, but I think it's very difficult to see how they didn't at the very least add to the general anxiety the British public were feeling in 1940 about the imminent threat of Nazi invasion that they faced. He was also considered to be a kind of an authority that people could tune into. The wider population certainly believed he was close to German military thinking, and it was thought that he was able to predict where German bombing raids would take place. Another rumour that was popular in British society in 1940 was that Joyce had a network of spies or fifth columnists supplying him with information, and that sometimes he would name a town or village where the local clock was running behind time. Now, none of these were actually true. He wasn't close to German military thinking. He had no idea about where the next German bombing raid would take place. But it does speak to how he was viewed by the wider British population. Furthermore, the British government did see fit to commission newsreels that mocked him, which also adds to the idea that he probably did have a degree of influence over the population, even if this was just heightening anxiety. Now, while he was famous for these broadcasts that started Germany calling, he did also work on black propaganda for the Nazis. Now, this was information that was disseminated in Britain from sources that wouldn't be clear to the listener. So they would have, for example, radio stations that claimed to be broadcasting from within Britain. Joyce himself wouldn't broadcast on these, but he did write for them. 1940 was the time that William Joyce was unquestionably at the height of his influence and power. Even Joseph Goebbels praised his work at this time. However, as the Second World War dragged on, his influence did decline both in Germany and in Britain. After 1941, the main theatre of the war shifted to Eastern Europe. Ultimately, 90% of all German casualties were on the Eastern Front. So as the fear of invasion diminished, people were less interested in what Joyce had to say. Indeed, after 1940, his own personal life deteriorated as well. He had been married twice by this point, and his second wife, Margaret, another committed fascist, had fled to Germany with him. While she worked in propaganda as well and was sometimes dubbed Lady Haw Haw, the two separated in 1941 for a time amid accusations of domestic abuse, affairs and heavy drinking. Now, the Second World War turned decisively at the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942 and then again at the invasion of Normandy in 1944. And by 1945, the Red Army were closing in on Berlin and the Allies crossed the Rhine, invading Germany from the west. While Joyce had continued to broadcast right through the war, his final transmission came to symbolise the pathetic collapse and dying days of Hitler's regime. By the end of April 1945, there was no question the war was going to end in a complete Nazi defeat in a matter of weeks, and Joyce had fled northwards towards the port city of Hamburg by this stage. And it was there on April 30th, coincidentally the same day Hitler and his wife committed suicide, that Joyce took to the microphone for a final broadcast. Amidst the chaos and disintegration of the Third Reich, William Joyce, now clearly drunk, made an incoherent, rambling broadcast. You can hear it here now. He's clearly intoxicated and you can hear a glass clinking on the table.
Germany, maybe. I may be wrong. I will only say that the German arms have been in many battlefields defeated. But I ask you, how could it ever be possible for England to maintain a front against Soviet Russia unless she had the help of the German legions?
From that, you can hear his confident, strident tone that defined his broadcasts in the early years of the Second World War was long gone. His words were slurred, but his Irish accent can still be heard. But he clearly knew the end had come, and the following words were his final sign-off.
In these last words, you may not hear from me again for a few months. I say, Es lebe Deutschland, Heil Hitler, and farewell.
After that broadcast, Joyce, accompanied by his wife Margaret, moved north to the Danish border, where he went into hiding. However, 4 weeks later, on May the 28th, 1945, a British soldier recognised his accent. That Galway schoolchild who had broken William Joyce's nose a few decades earlier, giving him his distinctive tone, had another fame to claim. Joyce, after being recognised, tried to flee but was shot and wounded. He was subsequently arrested, and in a few weeks he was put on a plane and sent back to England, where he was tried for high treason. Now, the trial itself would take place extremely quickly. He was arrested in May, and the case opened at the Old Bailey in London in mid-September 1945. It inevitably drew huge attention. It was not only one of the first post-war trials, but William Joyce was one of the few people who the British public would have felt they knew on some level. When the more famous Nuremberg trials opened later in the year, the Nazi leadership were in the dock, but men like Rudolf Hess, Hermann Göring and Albert Speer, while recognisable, were distant figures in the public imagination. Joyce, on the other hand, was a figure they must have felt a degree of intimacy with. He had broadcast into their homes, they had tuned into him, and ultimately this must have compounded a sense of betrayal. Despite the gravity of the crimes committed by the regime he had supported, William Joyce's case was one ultimately fought out over legal technicalities. He was tried for treason, a sentence that carried the death penalty, and Crown prosecutors pushed for hanging. However, to prove their case, the Crown had to demonstrate that William Joyce was a British subject, otherwise he couldn't be convicted of treason. To this end, they used Joyce's own successful British passport application in 1933 as the cornerstone of their case. However, it wasn't the open and shut case that it seemed. Based on this, while morally and politically indefensible, Joyce did have a strong legal argument that whatever he was guilty of, it wasn't treason. You see, back in 1933, when he had applied for that passport, he had lied on the application. He had claimed he had been born in Ireland before the partition of the island in 1922, which gave him a right to a British passport. However, as we heard at the start of the show, Joyce had in fact been born in Brooklyn. This made him an American citizen, and therefore he couldn't legally be accused of committing treason in Britain. However, in a Britain reeling from war, where large parts of London had been destroyed by German bombing, his legal point was not entertained. The prosecution argued that since he had applied for the passport himself, he was in effect a subject of Britain. Unsurprisingly, his jury had little sympathy and convicted him after 23 minutes of deliberations. While there was some disquiet in legal circles, 2 appeals were rejected. In January 1946, a few months shy of his 37th birthday, William Joyce was hanged as a traitor in Wandsworth Prison. He was unrepentant to the end, blaming the Jews for having caused World War II before saying, "I am proud to die for my ideals, and I am sorry for the sons of Britain who have died without knowing why." He was buried in the grounds of Wandsworth Prison, but few would mourn his death. William Joyce was one of 3 high-profile executions held in Britain after the war. A few weeks before his hanging, John Amory had been executed after he was also convicted of treason. Amory was another Nazi propagandist who had also tried to recruit British prisoners of war to fight for the Nazis. Somewhat sensationally in his case, he was actually the son of the British cabinet minister Leo Amory. The 3rd person executed was Theodore Schurch, a British soldier convicted of a slightly different offence, that of treachery, when he was exposed as working for German intelligence. Meanwhile, William Joyce's wife Margaret had also been arrested with him back in May 1945. She was held in a prison camp in Belgium, but she was briefly returned to Britain in November 1945 when she saw Joyce before his execution. She was never actually tried for treason and was eventually released in 1948. She would live in Germany for about 7 years, only returning to Britain in 1955. She actually had to reapply for citizenship as she and Joyce had both become German citizens back in 1940. Margaret Joyce died in London in 1972. 4 years later, in a final chapter in the story, William Joyce's remains were exhumed, and in early 1976 they were flown back to Ireland and buried in a cemetery in Galway, a somewhat ironic end to a man who seemed to despise the country he had grown up in. Okay folks, so that's where I'm going to leave the story of William Joyce, aka Lord Haw Haw. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any opinions or feedback, you can reach me at info@irishhistorypodcast.ie. Finally, don't forget to make sure you've subscribed to the Irish History Podcast to get my upcoming series, 3 Days in July. As I say, that's coming in June. Until next time, Slán.